All right, this is the Brown Duke Gun Show. My name is JP Garcia, here today with Brandon Elias. Today, we are going to get into the, just briefly touch on the TikTok incident, the death of the TikToker a few days ago who accidentally shot himself and died. And why we think that's important is it's something that proves that we need to continue to have the conversation about gun safety. Okay. And, we've heard it all before, but clearly, the gun safety rules were not followed in this particular scenario. And, all the respect and all the condolences and everything to the family. We're not trying to necessarily capitalize on this incident, to bring any sort of shade to that guy. But what we want to do is just go back to fundamentals and really deep dive into the safety rules and what they mean, because really this is something that is super important. And we, as a gun community, we need to be very focused on safety, right?
Yep.
So, anything you want to say before we dig in, really?
No, it's like safety is like your responsibility, right? Mm-hmm. And it's our job, if you are a gun owner, especially, we're setting the example for everybody else. So all these people that are anti-gun, the second they see something like this, they're like, see, that's why we shouldn't have guns, right? It's like, no, we should have guns. It's just people that don't know about them, they need to get educated about it.
Right. Yeah.
I definitely think that it should be in our school systems because even if you don't own a gun or if you hate guns, you're going to come across a gun one day. Our kids are going to come across a gun one day. So we just should have it in school systems, to where you know how to use it.
Right. So, and I think, and a bigger point on that is really that, the right, our Second Amendment right comes with a responsibility, right? And if you're not willing to accept that responsibility, you shouldn't be exercising the right. Maybe that's controversial to say, but I think if you're not committed to learning and practicing gun safety, then you probably shouldn't have a gun.
Right.
Yep.
And it's the same thing. Kids learn safety with knives, right?
Mm-hmm.
In a kitchen, you have it every day. So they learn safety with that. It's for some reason in the American culture, we stopped teaching kids about gun safety, right? We just said, oh, well, they're going to learn that later on whenever they get older. It's no, teach them as early as possible.
Sure.
I don't think that you should wait until a certain age. As soon as you possibly can, try to start teaching them firearm safety. There's an option for that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and before digging in, I guess you and I both have very similar feelings on that, and that our kids, right? Our kids are both, they're around the same ages,
yep.
all within a year of each other. And, we play a lot of games with guns, but we don't play shoot each other games with guns.
Right.
And I know that sounds innocuous, but it's also setting that habit in the beginning. It's hey, we don't point guns at people.
Yeah.
We point guns at targets.
Yep.
Right.
I think I said this in one other podcast before, but we had laser tag guns.
Mm-hmm.
I bought LA laser tag guns, but I would never put the laser tag on me. I'd set them up in the living room as targets.
Right.
So you don't put them on yourself and teach her hey, you're going to point a gun at me and press a trigger. It's never acceptable.
Right. Or yourself.
Or yourself. Never going to happen. So I just set up the little laser tag bases around the living room and just use them as regular targets.
Yeah.
Instead of shooting at each other.
Yeah. I think the other thing that we've done is that, you make the distinction between a squirt gun and a real gun, and to say, hey, okay, the point of this squirt gun, because they're going to have squirt guns, right? The point of this squirt gun is to spray. It's part of a game,
yep.
Right? But is it a completely different thing than a real gun, right?
Yep.
And actually, I don't know if you remember this, but when we had the airsoft stuff, when we used to do the airsoft for the kids on Sundays at the range, mm-hmm. We would, through their safety briefing, we would take them through, the whole thing. We're going to get into the safety rules in a minute, but we would take them and show them the differences between, okay, even so, this is an airsoft gun, and we practice all the safety rules with the airsoft gun, but also know the difference between the airsoft and a real gun. We walked them into the showroom and showed them these are the differences, okay? Mm-hmm. So even more heightened awareness around this is a real firearm here,
Yep.
Be very, very vigilant around these, and these are not for you guys to touch. You know, it's not a toy.
And I never would let Ellie have toy guns. Like if people would buy her toy guns and stuff, I would accept them, either throw them away or like store them the same way that I would store a real gun. Like she could not have it and she could not play with it unless I was there.
Right.
Because some of the airsoft guns, I mean, they look real. Like I have a SIG one that's like made out of aluminum.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
Like it looks just like a real gun. And I never thought that she could make the difference between the two. So now, like every gun that she picks up she treats it just like a real gun.
And he should.
Yep. Yeah. And like she has an airsoft gun. It's treated just like a real firearm. She doesn't point at people, any of that stuff. The only time and I remember like going to a party and they had like little squirt guns or like, little gel guns or whatever it was. And I remember telling her like, hey, you can't play this game.
Right.
And like she looked at me like, man, that sucks because all my friends are doing it. But then like I was like, it's because you have real guns at home and our situation is a little different. And she understood it instantly. She's like, yeah, Dad, I understand. And she like sat down and like some people might say, man, that's cruel. Like I can't believe that you didn't go let her do that.
Right.
But like I also have loaded firearms everywhere at the house.
Yeah.
Like I'm not taking that chance, right? And I don't think they should take the chance either, but it's not my job to tell you how to raise your kid.
Right.
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 So you can do whatever you want to, but like my kid's not going to be involved into that. Right?
Correct.
She would have like water guns like in the pool where they have like just a tube and like you push it. And it's not really, it doesn't look like a gun whatsoever. It's just like a pool noodle pretty much. And like you squirt people with it.
Right.
Like that I would let her have. But if it has a trigger and like a grip and everything, it's no go.
Right.
Like she cannot
I mean,
point
that
at
makes
people,
sense.
Because I don't think she can make the difference. She was so young at the age. Like now she's 8 and she's definitely like more mature and she kind of understands now. But at that age, like she started shooting when she was 4. There's no way I'd like think that she can make the difference between a fake gun and a real gun.
Absolutely.
At 4 years old, you know. So I just like, nope, you can't do it.
Right.
know?
Oh, and in particular, because you're absolutely right. She was around guns everywhere.
Every day.
At the store, at home. I mean, you're a firearms instructor. You own a gun range. I mean, come on, like
It's
literally.
the same people that like, said, oh, I can't believe you wouldn't let her play around with a gun, were the same people that walked into the range and I'd say, hey, Ellie, go and get this gun out the cabinet. And she'd like take it out the cabinet with all 4 firearm safety rules and walk up like with a gun in the air and be like, I cannot believe that she knows how to do that. Right. It's like, yeah, because there was a system in place.
Yeah,
right.
Absolutely. So, all right. So no, I agree. I think that's, a good primer to start digging into the rules of, the 4, universal, people call them whatever, the 4 firearm safety rules. Right. And I think the first one, treat all guns as if they're loaded.
And before we get into each one of them, like they're going to be slightly different wherever you look them up, right? The wording is going to be a little bit different, but they all mean the same thing. So we might not say the exact same words that you see on a poster or something, but you get the idea.
Yeah, don't get bent around the handle about the exact wording, right? You get the idea.
Terminology is like a mark of an amateur, right?
Yeah.
Like if you have a guy that's just focused on terminology, it's a horrible thing.
Yeah.
Like they're just trying to tell you what you're doing wrong, really, right?
Yeah.
Like as long as we can both communicate, we're okay.
Exactly. So treat all guns as if they're loaded.
Yep.
Right? And so that particular rule sounds very it sounds very easy to do, but what's the first thing that people will do? I've seen it at the range a million times. They'll pick up a gun and they'll just start waving it around. Yep. They don't press check it, they don't safety check it, they don't check the magazine condition, nothing.
Don't worry, it's unloaded. Like I don't care.
Right.
It doesn't matter if it's unloaded. And it's the same thing with the squirt gun thing, right? It's like, I'm gonna treat it this way because it's a not loaded gun or it's not a real gun. It's like, no, you treat them all the same. And the reason why that one's number 1, I think, is because it's the hardest, I guess, to learn over time because we want gun handling to be subconscious. It's just like driving a vehicle or anything like that. Like you get into a car, you drive to work, you don't remember putting on your blinker, right? Like it just happens because you do it every single day. So that's the reason why the first firearm safety rule is that way. If you start practicing all the safe gun handling rules, whenever you are handling a gun, it's just happening naturally. Like we're not actually thinking about safety. Like it's just automatically happening because we've been doing the same thing each and every time. Now it can go in reverse. So if you're doing all the bad things, that's whenever those things happen. That's whenever people would take out guns and start waving at people because they've been doing that since they were a kid and they never got taught the right way.
Right.
And they never really focused on it. So that's whenever people get in trouble. They're like, oh, I've been around guns forever. It's like, yeah, you've been doing them the wrong way forever, right? So like really focus on all those little details. And once you've mastered it, then you're always thinking about it, but you don't have to think about it as much. It's subconscious.
Right. Well, and I think, so for me, the habit that I want you to build, right, is that if you pick up a firearm, right, rifle, pistol, doesn't matter, and and you see me visibly check it or whatever you do, right? That doesn't mean anything. I want you to develop your own system for making sure that the weapon, gun, firearm, whatever you want to call it, is safe. Okay. And, I have my prop here, right? I'll show this. What I mean by that is, notice my finger, right? Off the trigger. So we drop the magazine and we check the action and there's nothing in there, right? And then
visibly look into
take a look inside, right?
Chamber and into the mag well, where you can see there's an empty chamber and there's like daylight coming through the mag well.
Absolutely. So now I know it's clear, okay? But now I'm going to hand this over to Brandon, and he's just seen me do this, but his process is going to come into play too, right? He does his own check, right? This is what we mean. You don't trust anybody to safety check your own weapon, right? You do it yourself, right? First thing, because then if you verified that it's safe, nobody can take away the experience that you have on yourself, right?
Right.
So, and then also that develops the habit of always safety checking the guns.
Right. And then like even simple things like, hey, I want to give this back to JP. I'm not going to take the gun and like point it this way. Like if I need to like put it down on the table or set it, go from muzzle direction to this direction to that direction, I'm either going to come up with it like this, or I'm going to come down with it like this, right? Like there's never one time where I like turn the gun and just like move it around this way because JP's sitting directly in front of me, right? So little things like that, even if I know the gun's unloaded and I can check it, then I'm still going to treat it that way, because if it is loaded one day, I'm going to get into the habit of just passing in front. It's like, oh, it's no big deal. I'm just going to pass it in front of him. No, that is a huge deal.
Right. Yeah. So I think that's treat all guns as if they're loaded.
Yep.
Right. Anything else you want to say on that one?
Nope.
Okay. Second rule, again, seems obvious, seems to also be hard to do. Never point the gun at anything you don't want to shoot, destroy, kill, whatever. I mean, so there are different iterations of this rule and they say different things, but the point of this rule is don't point guns at things you don't want to hit.
Yep.
Right. So going back to, the tragedy that happened on TikTok, and it's not the only one that's happened on TikTok. There have been several ones that, you and I were talking about when, before we started recording the show. It's that, don't point your gun at people, right? Don't, know where your muzzle is.
Yeah. It's just like what I was just saying earlier. Like, make sure you don't wave it in front. Like, just because it's a half a second that you wave it in front of someone, it still counts.
Right.
Right. The easiest way to do it, I tell people, is imagine a laser beam that's coming out the end of the gun, and you don't want to cut anything with a laser beam. Whatever the laser beam touches, it like burns a hole through it. So treat the gun the same exact way. As soon as you pick it up, if you got to go in a safe direction, there's usually only two safe directions in everyday life. One is up, one is down. Mm-hmm. That's it, right? Like keep it pointed in that direction when you're walking around with it. If you're at a range, a lot of times they'll tell you like point it at the trap the whole time. And that is the safe direction at that time. We don't have that rule at my range because I know how important firearm safety is. And I don't want people getting in the habit of just like constantly pointing the gun down range, because a lot of times there's innocent people down range too. Right? There's a bad guy, but there's also innocent people. So keep the gun pointed in the up direction or keep it pointed in down direction when you're walking around.
Right. Yeah. And I think it's the habit that I would ask people to develop is just muzzle awareness. Know where you're pointing the gun. Have awareness of where you're pointing the gun, right? And because it's so easy for people. And again, it's not that I'm talking as if just hypothetically. This is seeing people in gun ranges, seeing people at gun stores, just pick up guns and start waving them around. They don't press check them. They don't safety check them. They start pointing them at people, pointing them in directions they don't, they're not really aware of, right? And actually, the scarier part is sometimes, some brand new folks, well, I won't even say brand new folks. There are people who think they know what they're doing, and they'll go to the gun range with a loaded gun, and they'll finish shooting, and they'll start to point around, or they want to take a picture of it, and then then they're pointing down at somebody else, and they don't even realize it. You know.
Yep.
So
it's the same thing. Like you go like the water hose trick, right? Like the water's not coming out, so they look inside of it. What are you doing? Why you do that? And I think that rule, it's a whole lot easier to follow with long guns. I find that people, if you give them a long gun, since the barrel's longer, they kind of know where it's pointed at. Right. Whereas with handguns, they kind of like move their wrists a lot more. So then the gun kind of like goes everywhere. So just be very cautious of it, especially with handguns. Make sure you know where the muzzle's pointed at all times and don't start just wailing it around.
Right. Yeah. Agreed. Okay. Let's see. The third one in our deep dive, keep your finger off the trigger until your gun and your sights are on target.
Yep.
Okay. I mean, it sounds simple, but it's very difficult for people to get this one. This one's the one where, you can have it in a safe direction. A lot of times this is where I see people trip up the most. Yeah. Right. Where they're just, as soon as they pick up a gun, their finger goes on the trigger.
Yeah. Right. Brand new shooters, like never shot a gun before. Mm-hmm. Whenever they grab something, they grab it with their whole hand. Yeah. Right. Like they wrap all their fingers around something. And with a gun, you don't do that. Like your trigger finger stays high and as up as possible, and it stays straight while all your rest of their fingers wrap around the gun. So that's usually the most common thing I see. Another thing I see is like people that have some experience and they'll make excuses for it. Mm-hmm. Like, oh, well, I'm not like going to press the trigger. It's like, no, there's no exception of you having your finger either like on the trigger itself, on the trigger guard, any of that stuff. Like, there's no time that you're walking around and having your finger like this. If you trip and fall, if something startles you, you can start applying pressure and you get frightened, it slips off and presses the trigger, right? Yeah. So as high away as possible, somewhere on the frame of the gun. That way, if you do start applying pressure, it doesn't slip off. It's not even close to the trigger. And the only time that we do touch that trigger is if we are visibly looking like down the sights, and then I say like, hey, I made the decision, I want to shoot that thing, then I place my finger on the trigger. The second that my eyes come off of the sights, my finger comes straight, right? That's the easiest way to
absolutely.
Remember.
No, and I think this is where for a lot of beginners, and I think we've talked about this in different shows, that before getting into dry fire, before getting into how to properly press the trigger, I ask them, right? This is your drill when you go home. You take your firearm, you put it on the desk, and you pick it up 10 times without touching the trigger, right? That's your drill. It'll take 35 seconds, and then you put it away and you do it again tomorrow, right? And if you can go for a week without, picking up the gun, without touching the trigger, okay, now we can talk about, trying to improve your trigger presence, things like that, because now you've hammered home that point. But also keep practicing picking up the gun without touching the trigger, right? Because that goes away, Yeah. I mean, if you don't develop that habit and you make it kind of second nature to your system for how to handle a firearm, then that knowledge, that muscle memory is going to deteriorate.
Right.
So don't touch the trigger.
Yeah. Right. I mean, we talked about one time on this show, like this gun, like this open gun, the trigger's like, it's 2 pounds, probably, a little bit less than 2 pounds. So it's super, super light, and people ask us all the time, like, man, you never, just my pinky, like, barely touched it, right? The gun will go off. Like, you never, like, set the gun off. It's like, no, because my finger's not on the trigger until my sights are on target, until, like, I want to shoot the gun. That's the only time it goes on there. So you don't have to worry about how light the trigger is, as long as it's safe, right? As long as you're not, like, moving the gun around and it accidentally slips off the sear, then that's an unsafe gun. But if the gun's safe, the gun should never go off. The only time it does go off is if you have your finger on the trigger. That's the only excuse.
That's a complaint I heard about Glock a lot, right? That people want to have a safety that is not on the trigger. They don't feel safe by only having a trigger safety. And to me, it's like, no, your safety is your finger.
Yeah.
Right?
Off the trigger.
Right? Like, I mean, this is the key of gun safety. This is unsafe. This is safe.
Yep.
Right? So it doesn't matter what, I mean, it shouldn't matter that the blade trigger safety is on there, because if your finger's off the trigger doing what it's supposed to be doing, then you'll never be close to that anyway.
Exactly.
Right?
And even manual safeties like this has a manual safety on it, single action safety. The way I use safeties is the second that I pick up the gun, the safety comes off. So if I'm in control of the gun like this, my safety's off the entire time. My finger's straight, but my safety's off. The second that I go to set the gun down, then I click the safety on and then set the gun down, right? As soon as I pick it up, the safety's off because I'm in possession of it. So if you have a manual safety on, you're not walking around with the safety on like you shouldn't be. I don't do it that way. I don't suggest you doing it that way. But
unless you're carrying, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
like if you're carrying, if it's inside the waistband, then the safety's on.
Right, 100%.
The second that I draw the gun, that safety's coming off.
Correct.
I'm not keeping the safety on and waiting until like, hey, all right, now I want to shoot this person. Then I'm going to take the safety off, then put my finger on the trigger. It's like, no, the safety's already off. All I have to do is put my finger on the trigger and make it go off.
Right. I guess what I mean is that you don't want to carry with the safety off.
Yeah.
Right.
No.
Yeah. No, don't do that. No. Keep your safeties on. But yeah, keep your finger off the trigger. Yep. Right. And it sounds simple, but it is a learned thing. Right? Because firearm designers, they design these things to be very ergonomic in the firing position, right? They don't design them necessarily to be very ergonomic in the non-firing position for a reason, right? But as responsible gun owners, we need to develop the habit, right, of keeping our finger off the trigger. I think, again, it's fundamental, right? Yep. So focus on that. That's a good thing to do, right? Last one, be sure of what your target is and what's behind it. Okay. And I think, in an indoor range, you can get kind of lulled into a false sense of security with this one because it's very clear. It's easy to see what's behind it. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, at an indoor range, if you have your target very close, say 1 to 3 yards in, you can barely see what's around you. Right? All you can see is what's in the booth, really. Yeah. And if you start to shoot at a part of that target that's on the left side or the right side or up or down, do you know if you're hitting the ceiling? Do you know if you're hitting the floor? Do you know if you're shooting left or right? If you're hitting somebody else's target, particularly if they push those targets further out? You don't know, right?
I can almost say we see this almost every day.
Yeah.
Like people are just shooting on the top of the target or they're hitting their target differently. And there's very few times where people walk out and be like, hey, I noticed like if I hang my target and I shoot like the X ring, it's actually going to be hitting like the concrete like pretty close. Do I just like, what do I do? I'm like, oh, just move your target. I really appreciate you coming out and like, asking that question because usually we have to go and stop and be like, hey, like you're hitting the ground, you're hitting the ceiling, you're hitting one of the walls or the baffles or something like that. Move the target around if you want to shoot that target. Yeah. To make sure you ended up in the rubber burn trap.
Right. Yep.
Because a piece of paper is not going to stop the bullet.
No, right. It's supposed to, if you have a piece of paper that'll stop the bullet, it's either a bad bullet or it's like it's steel.
Yep.
So, but yeah, absolutely. I think, have more diligence outside, right? Particularly if you're shooting on somebody's property or shooting, at a range that you're not familiar with or those types of things where, because a lot of times I'll see people post YouTube videos of them shooting into a forest, and there's just a bunch of trees and a bunch of stuff back there. Some of the guys are pretty good. Like the Hickok guy, you can tell that he's got trees, but he's got a berm that's got to be
it's
30
like a
feet tall.
Berm, because he's like shooting into a creek or something like that.
Correct. Yeah. But there's some other folks who, they're shooting out into the wilderness at the same level, So what I'm getting at is that you may not know there might be people back there.
That's right.
Or animals or like anything. You don't know what's back there. So go before you start shooting, go check around what could be there, right? And not just immediately behind it, but go out 10, 15 yards behind that thing, right? Yeah. Because imagine that bullet's going to keep traveling.
Yep.
So
make sure that like no one's coming up on the other side of the berm or something like that. Like.
Yeah.
If you're who you shoot, I'm sure they're not. But like at the outdoor range that I go to, there's a pond that goes around the outside berm. So they have to like swim through the pond in order to like climb up on the berm.
Right.
And it was designed that way for that purpose.
Yeah. Well, exactly. But at the same time, if you weren't familiar with that, I know which range you're talking about. Yeah. If you're not familiar with that range, you can also visibly see down the range. That there's no obstructions, that, okay, here's this U shape and it's, 20 feet tall. And so long as you keep your targets at the bottom, you're going to be okay.
Yep.
So now anytime, again, know to target what's behind it. If you put it too high, where's your bullet trajectory going? You go out there with a rifle and you shoot the head box of something, your ammo may carry 700 yards.
Yep.
So
like in the military, I remember I had a guy that worked for me that was in the military, and we were going to do some outside stuff, and he like went through this whole thing of like on Google Maps and trying to see like how far the bullet trajectory would actually get if a rifle was shot like at a certain degree angle.
Okay.
Because whenever he went to I think it was like Trinidad or something like that it was called, he had to do that for work. Like he had to go wherever he did like a live fire operation. He was like, all right, I have to make sure the bullet does get out of here where it's going to end up. And like military owned all this property to where it wouldn't end up anywhere. I was like, man, this is crazy, like how much detail he's going into. But like that's what it took if a round got out of there.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, you have to.
Yep.
I think so. I mean, because they're responsible they're the ones who pulled the trigger at the end of the day.
That's right. Yep.
So, all right. So those are the 4 fundamental firearm safety rules, right? I mean, there are more in different applications. You can layer more on top of that, but I mean, I think this is fundamental, right? So I know you teach a lot of concealed carry classes, right? So, and you go over this all the time. Is there anything else outside of what we talked about that you want to add or cover at this point?
So we have like additional firearm safety to like other things besides the 4 firearm safety rules. So one is obtain and continue firearm training. So the more and more that you do something, the better that you can be at it, right?
Right.
It kind of goes back into firearm safety rule number 1. If you're doing the same things over and over again the proper way, that helps. But by what training means is different between training and practice. So practice, like you might know the rules and you think you're following them, but you're just practicing by yourself and there's no one to call you out on it. So if you go to training where you have an instructor there that's critiquing you and seeing the things that you're doing wrong, then he can say, hey, you're doing this, they're doing this. So that way you know what to go home and practice. So you go and practice those things over and over again, and then you go back and take more training after you've mastered them, right? So obtain and continue more firearm training. Only handle weapons while sober, so no alcohol, no illegal drugs, no prescription drugs.
100%. Yeah.
Like alcohol and illegal drugs is pretty obvious, right? But we still have every Mardi Gras where they close down the shop because people go to Mardi Gras parades and want to come shooting after. It's like, no, you can't do that. Like you're not coming in drunk wanting to shoot a gun. At a camp, you hear that a lot. Like, oh, we were drinking beer at the camp and decided to get guns out and stuff, and like actions happening. Like, the second alcohol comes out, like the guns need to get put away, right? No prescription drugs. Even though you're prescribed a drug, if it says like do not operate heavy machinery, then you probably should not operate firearms either, right? There's some prescription drugs you take daily, high blood pressure medicine, whatever that might be. That's okay, right? Because like that's to keep you functioning. But it's not to like alter your reflexes and your mindset and things like that. Inspect and maintain your weapon. That's another thing. Like whenever you're cleaning your gun, you don't want only just to clean it. You're also looking for like cracks and spring failures and anything that can cause catastrophic failures of the gun later on. That's a safety deal. You don't want to like have the gun blow up in your face. Correct ammunition is the same thing. So make sure you're using the correct ammunition for the gun. You can see guns getting blown up on YouTube all the time, or like we saw one get blown up in the range because the guy put just mixed match ammo in it and didn't know he chambered a completely different round. Like there was a 300 blackout and a 223, right? So 30 caliber bullet trying to go down a 22 caliber barrel, it does not fit. So the pressure has to go somewhere. Blew up his upper receiver and blew up the gun. He was wearing safety glasses and everything. Everything was fine, but he definitely had to get another gun.
Yeah.
So make sure you're aware of what's going into that magazine and what's going into the gun. You have all your magazines marked somehow to where you're not just grabbing a certain mag and jamming into the gun and, causing the gun to blow up.
When I got that 300 blackout, that was one of the things you told me, right? Because I have 223s. That's like, okay, JP, just make sure you have very different tactile magazines, And so I went out and bought a whole different set of 300 blackout only magazines that are completely different than my PMags for the AR, because it's like, okay, now I know they're different. Like
that's what. So people sometimes they have different colors. Like they say like, oh, all my clear mags are this, or all my black mags or FDE mags, whatever. I don't like that situation because like at nighttime you might not know what you're grabbing, or if you just reach into a bag. Also, they'll have like little bands, like they sell these little rubber band things or whatever that have like 300 blackout on them or 223. So like, oh, I have all my mags marked with this band. Right. Well, it doesn't help either because like you might not see what that's written on. You might like look at it very quickly and it's like, yeah, that's the right one, and throw it in there. Like I want a different tactile feeling. So like all of my 300 blackout mags are like mag pull mags or Daniel Defense mags. All of my 223 mags are like Lancer mags.
Right.
So it's completely different feeling, different polymer, different texturing on the mag. Like that's where I can tell instantly whenever I pick it up it's in dark or I'm not looking at the mag, anything, reach inside a pouch or something and have my eyes on the target. I can still feel like, hey, that is not the right mag that I need to have inside the gun.
Right.
So I like that idea a lot.
Yep. No, it's very good. Sorry, I interrupted you. And what other rules you got? Okay. Good. So look, I we go into this as probably, may think about this as kind of a very pedantic or like a very boring type of podcast, but I think it's really important, anytime something like this happens, that we go back to fundamentals and talk about gun safety, right? Because like you said before, there are people who are looking for any excuse to try to take this right away.
Yep.
And the more vigilant we are about paying attention to safety and making sure that we do everything that we can to make sure these types of things don't happen, I think it just reinforces our case that, this right, we are taking on the responsibility to have this right, and we're trying to educate as many people as we can, that kind of thing, right?
Yeah. If you don't do this, like you're not only hurting yourself, you're hurting all of us.
Yeah.
Right? Everybody
100%.
has firearms, you're hurting all of us. So if that's the way that you need to think about it that way and take it seriously. Don't just go through the motions.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, if you take anything away from this, be very, very vigilant about the firearm safety rules. Take this podcast, send it to new shooters, send it to other people who may need a primer, that kind of thing. We want this particular podcast to be a tool for you, for your loved ones, for the people you're trying to bring into, the firearms community, just to reinforce the need to be vigilant about safety, right? Because we don't want this kind of stuff to happen.
Right. And like, I usually hate doing this. Like, whenever people are new to firearms or anything, like you try not to make them feel uncomfortable. Like this is one of the subjects you do make them feel uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Right. Like embarrass them if they do something wrong.
Right.
Like especially the ones that think they know things. Like I will go out of my way to embarrass you to make sure that everyone in the room knows that you do not know what you're doing with firearms if you're breaking one of the safety rules. Because if you don't do that, you think that you didn't do anything wrong and you can continue doing it.
Correct.
Right? Like you need to know firearm safety no matter what. That's the very beginning.
Yeah. Well, and I think, to kind of lighten it up a little bit, the good thing about competition, because I'm always going to bring it back to competition, right? Is that when you're shooting in a competition, whatever you do, doesn't matter the sport, shooting sport, anytime you break the safety rules, you're done, right? You get sent home for the day, right? Like that is entry level expectation criteria for doing the competitions. That's why I think it's so good for people to do the competitions, because they're fun, but they also drive home the safety rules, right? And and not to make not to extend this to another 30 minutes talking about that, but the fact that the entry level criteria to continue playing the game is actually just being safe, then that's really just hammering home that this is how you practice being safe with a firearm, right?
Having guns in your hands more often the right way.
Yeah. So very good. Anything else you want to say about this?
Nope.
Okay. Well, thank you for listening. We are the official podcast of Sentry Defense. I think I forgot to say that in the beginning. If you're around the area, please come shoot with us. If you have questions about gun safety, if you have, people of all ages, kids all the way up to, older people, retired, whatever, doesn't matter. If you have questions about safety, come into Sentry Defense. If you're not in our area, reach out to us.
Facebook, Instagram, contact,
Twitter,
on the website, like you can email us.
Sentrydef.com is the website. You can reach out to me on Twitter, JP Garcia at JP Garcia. Brandon is at Defense Sentry.
Yep.
Reach out with questions. Reach out on Facebook, or wherever. We're on all the platforms. I'm not on TikTok, but Brandon is. whatever questions you have about this. No question is too stupid.
No.
Right? The stupid thing is to think you know what you're doing if you don't.
Yep.
So I think that's good enough for today. We've been preachy enough. Thank you all for listening.